3 horrifying Skinwalker Navajo encounters. The last story is crazy. Number 1. The thing that wore my grandfather's face. I grew up on the Navajo reservation, where the land is vast, the skies stretch forever, and stories of things lurking in the shadows are more than just legends. My family, like many others, has always respected the old traditions, never whistling at night, never speaking of certain creatures aloud, and always listening when the elders warned us of danger. One story, however, has haunted my family for generations. It's about my grandfather, though if you ask the elders, they'll say it wasn't truly him who returned. When my grandfather was young, before he had a family of his own, he went missing in the desert. It was late autumn, and he had gone out to check on his family's sheep before a cold front moved in. He was supposed to be gone only an hour, but when the sun set and he hadn't returned, my great-grandfather gathered the men to search for him. They combed the land, calling his name, tracking his footprints through the dust. The footprints went deep into the canyons, weaving between rocks, stopping in strange places before continuing again. And then, suddenly they just stopped. No sign of a struggle, no indication of where he had gone. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. For 3 days they searched. They found nothing. My great-grandmother, a medicine woman, warned that something unnatural had taken him. "If he returns," she whispered, "we must be certain it is him." On the 3rd night, just as the elders had begun discussing funeral rites, my grandfather walked into the village, barefoot. His clothes were tattered, covered in dust. His skin was too pale, his hair matted with sweat and dirt. But the worst part was his eyes, wide and unfocused, like he had forgotten how to see. He did not speak, even as my great-grandfather ran to embrace him. He just stood there, breathing heavy, blinking slowly, as if adjusting to his own body. The family brought him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and tried to get him to eat, but he wouldn't touch the food. He sat still, staring into the fire. Occasionally, he would murmur words under his breath, but they were too garbled to understand. Then, sometime after midnight, my great-grandmother began to chant. She had been watching him closely all evening, her eyes full of suspicion. As the chanting grew louder, my grandfather, if that was really him, began to shake. His breath became ragged, his fingers clenching the blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. And then, without warning, he screamed. It was not a normal scream. It was shrill, inhuman, like the sound of wind howling through dead trees. The entire family jolted awake as he convulsed on the floor. His body twisted, his limbs bent at unnatural angles, his mouth opened far too wide. My great-grandmother threw corn pollen at him and continued her prayers, her voice growing louder. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The thing wearing my grandfather's skin gasped, eyes rolling back, and collapsed. By morning, he was gone. The blankets were neatly folded. The spot where he had slept was cold. The door had been left slightly open, though no tracks led away from the house. My family searched for him again, but this time, no one truly expected to find him. A week later, my great-grandmother gathered the family and told us the truth. "That was not your grandfather," she said. "Something else took him, and something else brought him back." No one ever spoke of it again. My family never held a funeral, nor did they carve his name into the stone by our ancestors' resting place. It was as if he'd never existed. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows through the canyon, we hear his voice, calling our names, knocking on our doors, waiting to come back inside. If you're enjoying, please remember to like and subscribe for more. Number 2. The voice in the wind. My cousin David and I grew up hearing stories about the things that lived out in the desert. The elders always warned us, don't go too far from home at night, don't whistle in the dark, and if you ever hear someone calling your name from the trees, you run. You don't answer. You don't look. But when you're young, warnings feel like superstitions, just stories meant to scare kids into behaving. That's what I used to think, until the night David and I went camping near the Chuska Mountains. We were both in our early 20s, looking for one last adventure before he moved out of state for work. We packed light, just a couple of sleeping bags, some snacks, and a flashlight. No tent, no weapons. We planned to hike deep into the hills, set up camp near an old dry riverbed, and sleep under the stars. The hike was peaceful at first. The sun cast long shadows over the landscape, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. By the time we found a good spot to settle down, the sun was already slipping below the horizon. The desert at night has a strange kind of silence, thick and heavy, like the land itself is holding its breath. We built a small fire and sat around it, talking about David's plans, about how different things would be once he moved. But then, in the middle of our conversation, we heard something. A voice, carried by the wind. At first, it was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make us pause. We listened, thinking maybe it was another hiker or a distant animal call. But then we heard it again, clearer this time. It was saying my name. David and I exchanged looks. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, it sounded like you." The wind picked up, rustling the dry brush around us. And then, in the space between the gusts, the voice came again. Closer now, almost playful. "Help me. I'm lost." But the voice wasn't right. It wasn't just that it sounded like me, it was the way it was said. Flat. Emotionless. Like someone was trying to imitate me but didn't quite understand how human voices worked. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, against every warning the elders had ever given me. The desert answered with silence. David grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees. At first, we saw nothing but shadows stretching long over the sand. But then, movement. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It looked like a man. Tall, too tall, with arms that hung just a little too low. The light hit its face, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, featureless except for a stretched, gaping mouth. Then, it opened its mouth wider, and my own voice came out. "Help me. I'm lost." David dropped the flashlight. "We need to go. Now." Neither of us hesitated. We grabbed what little we had and bolted, leaving the fire burning behind us. The wind howled as we ran, and with it came the sound of footsteps. Too many footsteps, coming from all around us. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it watching. I could hear it whispering my name. We didn't stop running until we saw the headlights of my truck, parked just off the dirt road where we had started our hike. We jumped inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dust kicking up behind us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing, the hum of the engine, and the wind still whistling outside. But just as we reached the main road, David let out a shaky breath. "You know what's weird?" he said. "It never called my name, only yours." I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind moves just right, I swear I still hear it, calling me, waiting for me to answer. Number 3. There were 3 of us camping that night, me, my cousin Eli, and our friend Daniel. We had driven out past the reservation, deep into the high desert where the land stretched endless and silent. This was Eli's idea. He always liked pushing boundaries, venturing into places we weren't supposed to go. "Just one night," he had said. "No one will even know we were here." I didn't like it. My grandmother had warned me about places like this, places where the land didn't belong to us, where old things still walked at night. But I ignored my instincts and we went anyway. The day passed without anything strange happening. We set up camp in a clearing surrounded by piñon trees, built a fire, and cooked what little food we had brought. The stars came out bright and heavy in the sky, and for a while it was peaceful. Then he showed up. It started with a sound, footsteps, light and careful, moving just beyond the firelight. We all heard it. Daniel reached for the flashlight, but Eli, always reckless, just called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, after a moment, a man stepped into the light. At least I think it was a man. He was tall, too tall. His limbs were long and thin, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he wasn't used to standing upright. He wore old clothes, dusty and tattered, like something that had been left in the desert for too long. But it was his face that made my skin crawl. It was wrong. His features were stretched just a little too much, like skin pulled too tight over bone. His mouth was too wide, his eyes too dark, and he never blinked. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. His voice was strange, flat, emotionless, like someone imitating speech without understanding how it was supposed to sound. Eli, oblivious as always, just shrugged. "Sure, man. Have a seat." Daniel and I shot each other a look, but we said nothing as the stranger sat down by the fire. He didn't move like a normal person. His motions were too fluid, too careful, as if he had studied how humans behaved but hadn't quite figured it out. For a while, he just watched us. Not the fire, not the food. United States. Eli, completely unfazed, kept talking about nothing. Some story about a girl he met in town. The stranger didn't respond. He only stared, his face expressionless, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Then after a long silence, he turned to me. "You," he said. "Your skin would fit me well." My stomach dropped. Eli laughed. "What the hell, dude?" The stranger didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just kept staring at me, those dark, empty eyes locked onto mine. My hands clenched into fists. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Run." Daniel cleared his throat. "It's getting late," he said carefully. "We should probably get some sleep." The stranger tilted his head. "Yes," he said. "Sleep." No one moved. For the first time, Eli seemed to sense something was off. He glanced between us and forced a laugh. Yeah, man. You should probably head back to your camp." The stranger didn't move. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the trees. Then, with unnatural slowness, the stranger rose to his feet. His bones made a strange popping sound as he stretched, his limbs bending at odd angles. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness. We listened until his footsteps faded. No one spoke. Then, suddenly, the fire dimmed, as if something had sucked the warmth from the air. I shivered. The night felt heavier now, the shadows deeper. "We're leaving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. We packed up in record time, throwing our gear into our bags without bothering to fold anything. The whole time I felt watched, like eyes were peering at us from the trees. As we climbed into the truck, Daniel turned on the headlights. That's when we saw him, standing just at the edge of the clearing, where the trees swallowed the light. Still, waiting. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. Too wide, too stretched, as if his skin didn't quite fit his face. Eli slammed the gas, and we sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground. No one looked back. When we finally made it home, my grandmother was waiting for me on the porch. She took one look at me, at the fear still lingering in my eyes, and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked softly. I swallowed hard. What was it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small pouch of corn pollen, and pressed it into my hand. "Next time," she said, "don't let it sit by your fire." We never spoke about that night again, and I never went camping on that land again. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that fire, and the thing that smiled at me from the dark. Thanks for watching till the end. Please like and subscribe for more videos.